Hi, I'm Steph from Heinemann. Today on the podcast, we're joined by Carla España and Luz Yadira Herrera, co-authors of En Comunidad, Lessons for Centering the Voices and Experiences of Bilingual Latinx Students. If you haven't heard their two previous episodes, we invite you to go back and take a listen to them now. In this episode, my colleague Jacqueline Carabinas joined Carla and Luz to talk about translanguaging with poetry in your curriculum. Poetry can be a great teacher, and in teaching, it's imperative to speak to the multiple experiences and languages in a class. Their conversation started with describing how poetry sustains community.
This is Carla. I'd love to start with that poem that Eileen Almonte, my sixth grader, wrote. Just thinking about that experience of teaching poetry with my sixth graders. It was a bilingual dual language class, particularly that class with Eileen. And poetry as resistance in terms of how it looked like in that classroom, it really helped us resist the monolingual lens and that monolingual focus that's so often present in the curriculum that we get for teaching reading and writing, or also the monolingual focus of publishing. And so for us, which was really important as my sixth grade team, that we were planning for including poetry that was bilingual, including poetry that was multilingual. And in that particular instance where Eileen had shared her poem, we were including music. We had this beautiful partnership with the Silk Road Connect project that's led by Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble. And so we had musicians that would connect with our classrooms once a month. And it just so happened that that poem was shared right after a musician has shared their experience with learning their craft and sharing their music. So for us, it was poetry as resistance in terms of resist those monolingual practices. But I know that for Luz, we've also thought about resistance in other ways.
So in terms of topics, we think about topics that can be used for talking about resistance movements or just resistance in general for injustices around immigration, around class, working class, right? And other topics that might be relevant to the community. Well, the other day we read a poem by Francisco Alarcón called Working Hands. And one of the things that we talked about is about this idea currently about who gets to be or who is an essential worker. And when we think about who is key and critical to the food supply chain, we think about immigrant laborers, right? Or immigrant labor, and how they are considered essential workers now, but they've always been essential workers, and they are essential to feeding all of us right now. And so that's just one way that we can talk about current issues, and we can resist harmful narratives about who belongs, or who is essential, or who is important in society. So we love to draw from Francisco Alarcón's poetry, also Juan Felipe Herrera, who talks about the Mexican American or the Chicano experience in the United States, for instance. So those are just a few poets that we love to draw from, and when discussing resistance as a genre.
And poetry also for us is healing, right? And how timely was it that this morning, right before recording this recording right now, I was listening into a sixth grade class. It was their first time going live, the teachers going live in their virtual instruction. They've been doing modules online with tasks for different subject areas in their middle school in New York City. And this is the fourth week. I don't know. I lost track. Maybe fourth or fifth week. What is time? Fourth or fifth week of instruction. And they've now launched this third phase of going live for at most 15 minutes with different subject areas. And I got to listen in to some sixth graders read their own I Am Born poems that were inspired by Jacqueline Woodson's first poem in Brown Girl Dreaming that's titled I Am Born. And it talks about the moment she was born and what was happening around her immediate surroundings, but also what was happening in the country at the time that she was born. And it was so healing as a process for students to think about what was happening with their families, the time that they were born, but also in the country. And I got to hear some of their conversations and the feedback that their sixth grade teachers were giving them about how they observe them using repetition. They observe them including dialogue and what their family members were saying when they were born. And for me, it was beautiful to hear that this morning, as we had done similar activity at that same school, at this New York City middle school, 2 summers ago in a summer program, Woodson's poem, I Am Born, and hearing students really think about not only their own experiences, but sometimes they were interviewing family members to find out what was happening where they were born at the time that they were born. So poetry as healing for thinking about maybe traumatic events, or also thinking about healing not only in something that might be close to the family in terms of something that happened at home or at the place where they were born, but also more socio-political policies and how those impact children. And so issues like migration, immigration have come up in their writing. Issues like access to healthcare, which we might call it like access to healthcare or injustices around healthcare, but the sixth graders are talking more about using language more like families not being able to or being afraid to, and a lot of language at the intersection of injustice around healthcare, employment, and immigration policies. And so that's a little bit on how poetry has been healing for students as a way to process these events and policies in their lives.
And we also talk about poetry as teaching, and we use poetry in our teacher education programs. So we have to think about also how poets use translanguaging throughout poetry. And as we mentioned before in previous podcasts, translanguaging is the way that bilinguals perform language or do language. It's a way that we draw from our entire linguistic repertoire to communicate with each other, to make meaning of our surroundings, of our world. And so poetry often is a place where poets are drawing from their entire linguistic repertoire. Elizabeth Acevedo, for instance, she translanguages in her writing and her poetry. In The Poet X, she translanguages extensively. We as teachers can also support our students translanguaging through poetry. We can have bilingual poems. We can introduce poems that use features of English and Spanish or both, right? We can provide access to audio versions of these poems through SoundCloud or even YouTube performances. All of these are pretty widely available online. Also, we can provide students access to glossaries or translation tools so that they can interact with the text and examine how the poetry moves, right? The moves that the poets make to create their art. And hopefully that will inspire them to create their own and similarly draw from their entire linguistic repertoire.
One more thing that I'd love to mention in poetry as teaching is I've often by meaning when I visited schools around the country, when I've been doing virtual visits and conducting classes with teacher ed programs as well as middle grade that I've done, I've been sharing a lot the novels in verse that I've mentioned Brown Girl Dreaming as Jackie Woodson's memoir that's in verse, but really I'm so thankful for authors like David Bowles and David Bowles, They Call Me Guero Border Kids poems. I specifically was using the poem The Newcomer a lot, and it really was like having another teacher in the room. It really helped the classrooms that were either K-12 that I was a part of or with higher ed classrooms where we were talking about issues of immigration and the impact on children and families' resilience. And so it was like having, David Bowles was the other teacher in the room with me. I'm often having these conversations with Luz, right, where we keep recommending each other these novels in verse and saying, you know what, like we're bringing them into the classroom, and they are like poetry as teachers. These other poets and these other poems are accompanying us in expanding our understandings of the experiences of bilingual Latinx students. So just had to mention that because it's been really powerful in the classroom.
I love thinking of that, of authors as another teacher in the classroom. We always, we talk about, the classroom environment being a teacher, and it doesn't even stop there when you go beyond, what you think of as the teacher in the classroom. I love that idea. So thinking about the poems that you've mentioned and the authors, making choices about poems to include the voices and narratives that you center in the classroom sends a very clear message to students. Can you talk about the impact on students when you intentionally resist the monolingual white narratives that tend to dominate text choices?
Throughout our book, we explored the topics, right, on language, identity, and power structures. And poetry is a really nice way to explore those themes in a way that's really accessible. And so for us in our teacher education classrooms, for instance, we love to use the TED Talk, which is a spoken word performance by Dr. Jamila Lyscott. And it's called 3 Ways to Speak English. And we use it as a mentor text for our students to think about their own language journeys, as well as their own language ideologies, which we explored in another podcast. When we ask teachers to consider the ways that they have come to their understandings of language or the way that they view language, including English and varieties of English, that has a direct impact on the students they'll be teaching or they're teaching. Because the way that teachers view students' language practices, right, will impact the way that they teach them. And so we can use mentor texts like this TED Talk, as well as inviting students for themselves to share some themes or topics that they're interested in exploring, or making sure to get to know the school community or the community, the surrounding community, and explore topics that are important within that community context. Creating those spaces, right, is going to be important in terms of getting students to make connections with the classroom, between the classroom and their community experiences. And just rethink narratives, reshape narratives that might be harmful.
Yeah, I think we're very intentional too about, the question was around in being intentional to resist the monolingual white narratives. And so that means we have to be intentional to put forth text selections that are centering the voices and experiences of Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so for us, that means being intentional about those selections, because the pattern in our teaching, both in K-12 as well as with higher ed, is that students, not only do they see bilingualism and multilingualism reflected in the poems that we select, but their confidence changes. They are excited. How many of you have mentioned, oh, we're going to start a poetry unit, and you hear, oh, and I'm not talking about like with 3rd or 4th or 5th graders. I'm talking about with adults. Like Luz and I have this conversation really often. And then, and you get like this pit in your stomach and you get really nervous because poetry so often has been taught in ways that are harmful because the voices that are shared are not reflective of our students' populations. But also like there's just the joy has left, because it's just like, here you go, here's a rubric, and you make sure you include alliteration, onomatopoeia, and you're going to do a haiku on Monday, and then I'm going to teach you this other form on Tuesday. And so you lose the love and you lose the joy. And what we talk about is being intentional in centering these voices. It just brings the joy back into the classroom or into the learning spaces, because students feel validated. They're opening up to a variety of experiences. So, for example, I was not born in the South. I don't have of the U.S. I don't have the experience that Jacqueline Woodson talks about it in Brown Girl Dreaming. I don't have the experience of the character, and They Call Me Guero, in David Bowles' novel, of going through what he goes through and navigating different spaces. But I feel like I've been made such a better person, right? I'm growing as a reader. I'm growing as a friend. I'm growing as a human being when I interact with these texts that are showing me the experiences of the most marginalized and those whose voices have been silenced. And I'm just so thankful because I've been able to see that impact on the students, where they change as people, right? Where their awareness grows. And so if we can create more spaces like that, then that just makes my day.
I think I heard you both describe in one way or the other about the intentionality. And I think that, when we don't center a variety of voices in the classroom, then certain voices become other. And if they become other, then students in the classroom that might connect personally with those, they feel then that they are other. And it just seems to have this domino effect on students. And giving those examples of how you don't necessarily, Carla, relate specifically with the text that you read, but it's made you a better person. I think that really links to what Luz was saying earlier about how, teachers have to intentionally make these choices. It's for everyone. And it's not just if you are multilingual, bilingual, monolingual. You have to make these choices for everyone. It's for yourself and it's for your students. And it reminds me of something you said in the book about unlearning the way that you taught poetry. There's a lot of unlearning to be done. If you think about your experience in school, you probably had a long list of the white narrative poems that you're mentioning. And so if you don't unlearn that, then that's what's going to persist. So I just heard a lot of connections between what the two of you are both talking about.
That reminds me of the instance that I've shared in the past about doing a poetry workshop where I had Jamila Scott's video clip with middle grade that Luz just mentioned earlier. Maida del Valle, her video, her spoken word tongue tactics. I believe it was either tongue tactics or descendancy, or the grandmother poem that she delivered at the White House when President Barack Obama, and a Langston Hughes poem. There we go. So we had that text set, and I'm going through the first two. So I played the two video clips. Students are interacting in small groups. It's really exciting. And there were teachers watching this demo lesson in the classroom, and the principal raises her hand and disrupts, and she says, well, when are you going to start teaching real poetry? When are you starting the poetry, for real, the real poetry? It's those other two weren't real. And so that kind of reaction, right, from this white woman who was leading a school in a predominantly Latinx neighborhood. It was mostly students from Dominican Republic. And whether I was there or if I were in, Scarsdale, New York, or Westchester, wherever it might be, more white spaces in that same state, that's poetry, And so we're talking about this form, we're looking at rhythm, we're looking at these themes. And so the fact that principle needed to unlearn, right? And that we all need to do that unlearning. It's a life's work of unlearning, because the work of colonization just hasn't stopped. And so it's still in our schools. It's still in the ways people's land has been taken. It's still in the ways, people in Puerto Rico have dealt and continue to deal with this. And so I'm highly concerned that it's taught as if it were just history, and we're looking at poetry in such white monolingual ways. And so I'm really excited to keep sharing with this book and in other formats, other poets and poems that we can bring into the class and learning space.
In the book, you give examples of plans for including poetry across the week, across the month and year. And I love the imagery of lingering with a poem over the week. When I read that word choice for thinking about spending time with a poem over the week, I love that idea of it anytime, but I really love it, especially thinking now with the learning situation we find ourselves in with schools. What an opportunity to spend the week with a poem. But anyway, I know the power of what this can do in the classroom, and I'm sure a lot of people listening do as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing you both describe your approach to planning these lessons and what you share in the book.
So this started in my experience as a middle grade teacher in a school that was K-8. And I used to do a lot of visits in my school to other classrooms. So that was a big part of the teaching philosophy. You get to be a better teacher by watching other teachers and being in conversation with them. And I noticed that in the lower grades, they would spend so much time on poems and songs. And it was like a staple of the kindergarten and the first grade classrooms, right? And they would do shared reading, and they would have these poems written on big chart paper and point to the words, and kids would read them together. And it was participatory. It was exciting. And then the higher up you went, talking about my own grade, the sixth grade that I was teaching, or seventh when I taught seventh, and I was a coach for 4 through 8, it just wasn't there it wasn't as present as the lower grades. And so we decided to bring it in and say especially because we wanted to keep the excitement going and talk about topics. And so we looked at ways to have poetry be a part of our instruction throughout the school year. And so the way we planned it was we thought about topics that would be of interest to students, and we looked for poets, again, that were that most represented populations that we weren't learning from or hearing from in other parts of the curriculum. And so those voices that we wanted to bring and amplify. And so that meant for me that we had a month where it was all Langston Hughes poem, and we planned to have one poem a week. And we would plan it so we would have a poem a week by the same poet across the month. And so by the end of the school year, students would have interacted with different poets and different poems. And so what we do in chapter 6 of the book is that we have some examples of what that might sound like or look like. And so we have, for example, thinking about topics to start the school year, maybe thinking about bilingualism and talking about poems about bilingualism for week 1 or bilingual identity, about family or family time in week 2. And we recommend the poetry anthology for celebrations, holiday poems for the whole year in English and Spanish. Not only is it a great anthology for different poems for the lower grades or upper and elementary, but also they have the the audio of the poems on SoundCloud. So that's really helpful, especially now if we don't have access to the print copies, or as people wait to get things in print in the mail or get digital copies, then you also have the audio, which is really beautiful. Week 3, we could talk about books or libraries or texts in our lives. And week 4, challenges or hopes. So some kind of themes that we pick for the week. And those last 2 weeks, we were recommending Margarita Engel has a wonderful book called Bravo Poemas or Poemas sobre Hispanos Extraordinarios. So it's titled Poems About Amazing Hispanics is the title. It's illustrated by Rafael Lopez. Beautiful illustrations for different figures throughout history and the present. And so we recommend using some of those. And that's what that might sound like if we were planning across topics like that. For 6 through 8, we were thinking about those same topics, right? Bilingualism, family, texts or books in our lives, challenges and hope. But this time, returning, we can look at David Bowles' poem, Losing My Accent. Also, the poems that are in They Call Me Güero. Obviously, I would definitely return to The Newcomer as one of my favorites in They Call Me Güero. But then also about family, thinking about Francisco Alarcon's wonderful, that poem is so impactful, In a Neighborhood in Los Angeles, in un barrio de Los Angeles, that we have these available bilingually. It was so beautiful to see pictures and get updates from a friend of mine in New Jersey who was trying these out when I just kept sharing different poems and how it impacted students on the East Coast to read about a poem about a place on the West Coast, but then they were writing about their own neighborhoods as well. And we've used a lot Carol Boston Weatherford's Schomburg, The Man Who Built a Library, that's also available in Spanish, illustrated by Eric Velázquez. Just really thinking about those themes that are connected to students' lives and finding these poets and voices that we want to amplify and planning across the week, so that in chapter 6 of our book, we have a helpful guide for when you plan across the week, thinking about ways that not only the teacher reads, but the class engages in reading with the teacher every single day. So there's this beautiful, that you're just listening to these poems and reading together, and then having discussions across the week that could focus on different things, right? So you think about meaning on one day, on another, you might discuss figurative language or the craft moves that the poet makes. You might have a short conversation one day about translations, or look at the English version of one, the Spanish version of another, or some poems that blend different features of languages. And you could discuss what those translations might mean to you, or if you would say things differently. And ending always with some kind of response if children want to perform, they want to write their own and be inspired. So that's a little bit of how we planned. So that way poetry doesn't stay in April, but you could keep celebrating poetry in April, National Poetry Month, but it should be throughout children's lives.
Teachers can also support students' writing of poetry across the month, across the year, is to have poetry centers or poetry stations. And we like the idea of centers because centers typically are spaces where students can really take ownership of what they're doing and really lead their own learning with the teacher as a facilitator instead of sort of dictating. But we can have a center where students just watch spoken word poetry being performed to see how it's done, or some examples of how it's done, right? We can have a center where students can rehearse favorite poems, maybe not their own yet, but other poems that they like. They can, rehearse with each other in a small group. and another center where they can rehearse their own poetry and just kind of get a feel of what it feels like to share in front of others in a small sort of safe group, right? You can have other centers where students can create some sort of digital media. Maybe they can audio record or video record themselves reading these poems that they've created, or perhaps poetry from others that they like. And even another space or center where students can create or merge their poetry with images and audios, whatever inspires them, that tells a complete picture of whatever it is that they want to communicate or express. So that's just one way that we can support the creation or this students' creativity and just student performance and sharing across the year.
So where should we look? Which authors should we be seeking out? You've listed a ton already. So where should we look when we're looking for poetry that honors translanguaging? And how can this be integrated into our remote instruction now? You've talked about this a little bit already, but I'm thinking, I'm listening to this. I'm really excited now. I want to, as soon as I'm done listening to the podcast, start searching to see what I might be able to include. Where will you send us?
One wonderful resource that we love is poets.org. And you can sign up to have a poem delivered directly to your inbox every single day. And it's kind of a nice way. If you're like me, the first thing you do, which I know you're not really supposed to do, is check your email. I just can't help it. Just grab my phone and check my email. I love to see that in my inbox, so that's a kind of a really nice way to start your day. But this tool, for instance, enables you to search for poets by genre or by movements. For example, New Yorker poetry, or if you're interested in slam poetry or spoken word poetry, you can search like that. Or you can find poems by theme. Maybe you're interested in social justice or immigration, or like we mentioned before, family or bilingualism, bilingual identity. You can find them by theme as well.
Well, we've also created, in chapter 6 in the book, we have over 15 poets that we created this list to share with our readers that are all poems on language, power, and identity. So if you'd like to create those kind of plans that we've been discussing, like poetry across the week, across the month, across the year, we really recommend that you check out that figure 6.7 in chapter 6. We have a lot of poets there that we wanted to highlight along with their poems. But also something that I do and I check almost on a daily basis. My inbox, Luz, is ridiculous. So I do love that. I understand the sense of like opening your email and seeing a poem. Yes. But usually if I even attempt to, like, when I go open my email, I just get a lot of anxiety, especially now, which is everything's adding up online. So something that I do that doesn't give me that feeling, it's the opposite, is I follow a lot of poets on social media. And so following the poets, and they've shared a lot of poetry readings. They share a lot about new releases or books or videos of themselves reading poems. And so like Jose Olivares, poet in Chicago who wrote Citizen Illegal. I follow Margarita Engel, who's, I don't know, does this woman write like a book a week? She's just so prolific. It takes up so much of my shelf, and I've been sharing so many of her books, like her memoir Enchanted Air, also in verse. Jacqueline Woodson, Kwame Alexander, Jason Reynolds, right, our National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, Joy Harjo, our U.S. Poet Laureate. It's just been so helpful for me to follow their accounts, and also I think recently Nikki Grimes was uploading to her YouTube some videos that were so helpful for me, because as she was discussing her process of writing from that beautiful book I used with middle grade, One Last Word. It's Wisdom from the Harlem Renaissance. And so she uses the golden shovel method, and the illustrations are beautiful. They're all by Black artists. And there's an illustration that accompanies every single poem in that book. But recently she was sharing on her social media some videos of her reading some of those poems and talking about her writing process and what that sounds like, looks like. So I highly recommend that if you take a look at the list in chapter 6, that you then go and find these poets on social media and really follow them, because you'll get the latest from them as well.
And I definitely can't, I definitely don't want us to leave without recommending that you all listen to Juan Felipe Herrera's latest poem called Social Distancing. And it's a beautiful poem that expresses some of the feelings that many of us are having right now. And the really special thing about this poem is that it's also what he calls a solar circle poem, which can be read in any direction, or it could be, as he recommends, cut out and spun like a wheel so that you can just start it at a random place. And it's just a reminder that poetry constantly breaks boundaries, right? There are really no boundaries in poetry, and it's an art form that can really be, I think, what we make of it. And so that's just a really important reminder and a really relevant poem right now. So check it out, Social Distancing.
What would you say to teachers who say, okay, this is great, this sounds wonderful, but I don't have time for this in my curriculum calendar, or this isn't on the list of things that my administrator has given me to address for the year. Time is always an issue in education. So what advice do you have for teachers to include this important practice?
Well, one easy way to think about including poetry every day or every week or every month is think about what are the themes that you're exploring in your current curriculum, whether it is maybe your ELA curriculum or your language arts curriculum. What are some of the themes that you're exploring, and what are some poems that can really complement those themes? And maybe you can have that posted up for the week or for the month for students to revisit and make connections.
Also, I think in thinking about that question, you can go back and look at not only the themes like Luz is saying, but also what are the kinds of writing that you're teaching. Look at the forms of expectations of writing. And maybe students are writing personal narratives. Maybe they're writing realistic fiction narratives. Wherever there is narrative, right, why not bring in novels in verse, right? You can bring in memoirs in verse as mentor texts. You can bring in realistic fiction novels in verse as mentor text. So like Aida Salazar's The Moon Within, I recommend that book at every middle grade that I visit, every middle grade teacher I speak with. Really powerful themes and great character development. But those poems, I mean, we quote in chapter, I think it was like 4. Yes, in chapter 4, we have this excerpt from it. I mean, listen to this. Our ancient ancestors honored our flowering in this way. It is a ritual taken away from us during so many conquests. And that comes from Moon Ceremony poem in The Moon Within, where the mother, it's the dialogue between the mother and daughter, and the daughter is about to get her period and is all hesitant and really not embracing the way the mom is embracing this time in her life and preparing for this moon ceremony that the mom wants her to have. And so really thinking creatively, right? Are there places in the curriculum where I'm expecting students to read narratives and write narratives? Then I can bring in these stories, like Guadalupe Garcia McCall's Under the Mesquite. ¿Qué más? There's just so many texts that have impacted me as a reader and also as a writer that I've been using within those writing units or writing instruction, right? Like we mentioned earlier, Margarita Engel's memoirs. Also, she just has a lot of texts that are written in verse. And so really looking to those as your other teachers, right? As we were saying earlier in the classroom. And like I shared, the shared reading and like those plans of reading poetry across a week that you could plan. They don't have to be 40 minutes, right? Each day. It could be 10 minutes. And I've had those conversations with, there was a second grade team in El Barrio in East Harlem in New York. And we were curriculum planning, and they had that same exact reaction when I looked over their scope and sequence for reading and writing across the year. I didn't see poetry, and I just wanted to cry. I was like, how do you not have poetry? And they said the same thing, Jacqueline. They're like, nope, there's no room. Like, this is what we have to do. It's part of our curriculum. And I said, okay, if I'm not saying you have to add a whole poetry unit, but what if we did poetry 10 minutes a day? And I started with them like 3 days a week. That was it. I was like, if you do 3 days a week, 10 minutes a day, and we'll break it down in this way where we read the text together, and then we look at some figurative language, and the students get to respond by reading it and performing it out loud or writing their own. And we did it, and it was so powerful to see the excitement in the room. It was bilingual. The teachers were excited to plan that way. And so I think that's that's an accessible way to bring it in, and connecting it with the themes, topics that Luz was saying, and also thinking about these texts as mentor texts.
Thank you so much for having us. We really appreciate connecting with you all in this platform.
And we hope everyone takes some time to read poetry and write some of your own as well.
My thanks to Carla, Luz, and Jacqueline for their time today. En Comunidad is available now from Heinemann.com. Follow Carla on Twitter at Profesora España and Luz at @DRA_Luz Yadira. Learn more at blog.heinemann.com.
The Heinemann Podcast is a production of Heinemann Publishing. It is produced and edited by Steph George. Sound mixing by Steph George. Our creative producer is Lauren Audette. And our executive producer is me, Brett Whitmarsh. To learn more about the Heinemann Podcast, visit blog.heinemann.com. Thanks for listening.